Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, our 2025 Virginia Energy Legislative Update. My name is Brad Nowak. I'm a partner and co-chair of the Energy Practice Group at Williams Mullen. Our Energy Practice Group has a team of over 30 attorneys and other advisors who help clients navigate all aspects of the development, permitting, financing, construction, operation, sale of energy projects. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by my colleague, Chris McDonald. Chris is an attorney and lobbyist who serves as Director of Government Relations with the firm's Government Relations Group and is also a member of our energy team. Chris provides lobbying services to clients before Virginia's legislative and executive branches of government, including state agencies and boards. Chris has extensive experience lobbying key energy legislation in Virginia on behalf of industry associations, groups, and developers. And this is our 5th year doing our annual legislative update, and like other years, we'll have a lot to cover today. In addition to Chris, Williams Mullen's government relations team has several other team members who represent clients in government relations activities at the state and local levels, with a special focus on Virginia and North Carolina. Before we kick off today's program, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. At any point during the presentation, you can submit questions by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. And we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And if we have any, if we go over time, if you submitted your question, we'll follow up by separate email. If you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same Q&A button and someone will get those resolved. And then finally, we will email a copy of the PowerPoint presentation as well as this webinar by email later today. It will also be on our website. So we have a lot to cover. There's a lot of activity during this year's General Assembly session. So during today's webinar, we'll start by providing a general overview of this session's General Assembly session. Then we'll walk through several key energy bills, including the widely talked about and much needed solar siting reform efforts, a bill to allow localities to include a provision as part of their lane development ordinances to include solar canopies on parking lots, amendments to the multifamily shared solar program, a bill relating to prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements for RPS eligible work, talk about a solar interconnection grant program, amendments to the utilities IRP plans. We'll also talk about several bills which were proposed to amend the Virginia Clean Economy Act of 2020, including expansion of distribution generation projects, solar on schools, and energy storage expansion. And then there were several bills relating to virtual power plants and also a permit by rule amendment that included interconnection facilities as part of the PBR permitting process. Lastly, we'll provide an update on the 2025 elections in Virginia, and then that's next steps ahead in terms of legislation. And then at the end of today's presentation, we'll have a time for a couple questions. So with that overview, let me pass the program off to Chris.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate it. Always happy to do this. Yeah, we've been doing this for several years now, and it's always a treat to look back a bit at what happened in session and then look ahead to what might be coming in 2026. And as you noted, we got a lot of ground to cover. As us energy lobbyists in Virginia have been saying a lot lately, Virginia is for energy bill lovers. It's our own personal motto for the state. But we'll go ahead and dive in. Next slide, please. So as always, I think it's helpful to provide a bit of broader context into the year's legislative session before we actually get to the bills. While 2024 was a major year for federal elections, in Virginia, we had no state elections. So we actually entered 2025 with the same political landscape as we did in 2024. In the Senate, Democrats maintain a narrow 21-19 majority. Senator Scott Surrevelt, a longtime clean energy champion, remains Senate Majority Leader, while Senator Ryan McDougal remains Senate Minority Leader. On the other side of the Capitol building, Democrats maintain a narrow 51-49 majority in the House of Delegates. Delegate Don Scott remains Speaker of the House, while Delegate Todd Gilbert, a former Speaker himself, remains Minority Leader. So Democrats still control, by the narrowest of margins, the entire legislative branch. Zooming out a bit to our statewide offices, Republican Glenn Youngkin is serving his last year as governor. Republican Winsome Earl Sears is finishing out her term as lieutenant governor, and Republican Jason Miyares is still attorney general. Coming into session, committee leadership also remained the same this year as well. Senator Creed Deeds, another longtime renewable energy champion, serves as chair of Senate Commerce and Labor, while Delegate Joanne Ward serves as chair of House Labor and Commerce, a post that she's held on and off over the last several years. Also wanted to point out our leadership in the local government committees, as that's where an increasing amount of energy policy has run through in the last couple of sessions. Delegate Candy Munden King chairs House County Cities and Towns, and Senator Jeremy McPike chairs Senate Local Government. Next slide, please. 2025 marked Virginia's biennial short session, which lasts just 46 days. Our long sessions, which occur in even years, last a whopping 60 days. So even or odd, given these timelines, you can always trust Virginia to move at breakneck speed. And despite just having 46 days to complete their work, the General Assembly still introduced a lot of legislation. This year, the House and Senate combined to introduce over 1,994 bills, and this does not count resolutions. According to Virginia's Legislative Information System, of these, the governor signed 605, amended 160, and vetoed a staggering 157 bills. This is the second most vetoes handed down in history, trailing only Governor Youngkin's 201 vetoes in 2024. And this year's number will still likely climb. As of today, Governor Youngkin's veto total sits at 399, which is record-breaking. In fact, this is 279 more vetoes than the next highest total tally ever, held by Governor McAuliffe with just 120. So we're talking about truly unprecedented levels of negative action on legislation. Now, the General Assembly still has the chance to act on all legislation that was vetoed or amended, and they'll return to Richmond on Wednesday, April 2nd to do just that. Vetoes may be only overridden by a 2/3 vote, so it's extremely unlikely we see any overrides this year. Amendments, on the other hand, may be rejected by a simple majority vote, so there'll be plenty of those to watch out for. That being said, however, if amendments are rejected, the bill is sent back to the governor in its original fashion, and the governor must decide then whether to sign or veto the bill outright. So even if amendments are rejected, many, if not most, amended legislation that is sent back to him will likely end up on the wrong end of the governor's veto pen. Next slide, please. Next slide. We'll start today with some legislation that actually didn't make it to the end of the road, siting reform. This year, one of the biggest legislative issues for the energy industry was in solar siting reform. As any developer on this call knows, it's getting more and more difficult by the day to get a project permitted in Virginia, largely thanks to local government resistance and the ever-increasing number of bans or de facto bans that are being adopted. Not only does this resistance to and rejection of solar energy risk Virginia failing to meet the goals of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, but it increasingly threatens Virginia's ability to provide reliable and affordable electricity to ratepayers and businesses across the Commonwealth. Stakeholders and legislators, as well as bodies like the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation, or CURE, spent months leading up to this session developing various pieces of legislation aimed at addressing this alarming problem. The results of this were basically two pairs of bills, HB 2126 and SB 1190 being the first pair, and HB 2438 and SB 1114 being the second pair. We'll start here with HB 2126 from Delegate Rip Sullivan and SB 1190 from Senator Creed Deeds. This legislation was really worked out via a series of meetings of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation and resulted in the proposed creation of the Virginia Energy Facility Review Board. Thus, throughout the session, we refer to this legislation as either the CURE bill or the Review Board bill. This review board would be tasked with conducting critical interconnection reviews, conducting analyses and studying policy opinions, reviewing regional energy plans, local comprehensive plans, and local solar and storage ordinances, and facilitating the responsible siting of critical interconnection projects in the Commonwealth. The review board was also tasked with developing model ordinances for siting, permitting, and zoning of critical interconnection projects and all other utility-scale solar and energy storage projects. In addition to establishing the review board, this legislation also required that each planning district commission, or PDC, adopt a regional energy plan that would be approved by the board to address energy generation, storage, and use, and demonstrated the PDC's contribution to Virginia's overall energy mix. Finally, HB 2126 and SB 1190 established the Virginia Clean Energy Technical Assistance Center that would provide technical assistance to state agencies, PDCs, localities, the review board, and other public and private entities. Next slide, please. The other pair of bills introduced were HB 2438 from Delegate Candy Munden King and SB 1114 from Senator Schuyler Van Valkenburg. These bills were referred to as the siting standards bills. What this legislation did was propose reasonable provisions and criteria that a local government could include in their land use ordinances. This includes things like specifications for minimum setbacks, fencing, solar panel height, grading, and more. This legislation also set standards for things like stormwater requirements, decommissioning plans, or mitigation of wildlife impacts. Basically, these bills tried to establish reasonable criteria for what a locality could or could not require from the developer. Whereas the first set of bills were a bit more direct in their reform efforts, particularly through the regional energy planning piece and the review board, this set of bills was intended to offer a more reasonable, lighter touch path to reform. And this legislation was really the preferred option for the industry and was supported by most of the major solar and storage trade associations as well as developers. Next slide, please. Well, as stated at the outset of these slides, unfortunately, none of these reform efforts survived the session. Interested stakeholders could not agree on the best path forward. Namely, the industry wanted one thing, but the environmental community wanted another. And more critically, the House and Senate could not come to an agreement on how best to move forward with this issue. We saw this in tension both between the chambers and within the chambers themselves. Delegate Sullivan's review board bill was gently killed in House Labor and Commerce, while Senator Deed's review board bill survived the committee but actually failed on the Senate floor, with one Democrat not voting and another Democrat joining the Republicans to vote against the measure. Early on in session, Senator Van Valkenburg's siting standards bill had been rolled into the Deeds Review Board bill, so it never got a full vote. Delegate Munden King's siting standards bill did pass the full House, but upon arriving in the Senate, couldn't survive Senate Commerce and Labor, where the measure was defeated by a vote of 7 to 1. Next slide, please. One thing that us lobbyists have been hearing a lot over the last couple of years from legislators is, why don't we put more solar on rooftops or parking lots? Well, this legislation tried to directly address that. HB 2037 from Delegate David Bulova would have authorized any locality to require solar be installed on surface parking areas as a condition for approval of a new development. This would have applied to non-residential surface parking lots with at least 100 spaces, and a locality could require coverage of up to 50%. This was permissive, not mandatory, and did allow for some leeway for the locality. In its final form, HB 2037 passed the House on a bipartisan basis and passed the Senate on a narrow party line vote. This bill clearly caught the attention of Governor Youngkin, who quickly vetoed this legislation as a part of his first few vetoes of the year. Next slide, please. If you've been following along here in Virginia, or at least tuning into these webinars, you know that community solar, or shared solar as we call it in Virginia, has been a hot issue the last several years. We've seen many bills addressing our shared solar programs, including some significant expansion legislation that was passed and signed into law in 2024. This year, we saw a more targeted approach to shared solar. Delegate Irene Shin's HB 2090 addressed multifamily shared solar. This legislation proposed amendments to the existing multifamily shared solar program to include facilities that are located on a rooftop of a commercial building that shares a common or adjacent substation of the utility with the multifamily shared solar subscriber. This bill also added minimum bill requirements to this program for the first time, mirroring, in a way, the minimum bill requirements that exist in Dominion and Appalachian Power's standard shared solar programs. In its final form, HB 2090 passed each chamber on partisan votes and was ultimately vetoed by Governor Youngkin earlier this week. Next slide, please. Following the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, Renewable energy developers wishing to take full advantage of the investment tax credit or production tax credit were required to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements for the development of their projects. Here in Virginia, certain organizations and stakeholders grew fearful that with the new Trump administration coming in, they may begin taking steps to repeal the IRA, and as such, champion legislation that would effectively mirror the IRA's requirements, but at a state level. Thus, HB 2356 and SB 853 were introduced. This legislation required that any public service company or developer must pay a prevailing wage for any worker doing construction, maintenance, or repair work on any RPS eligible project. Additionally, it requires that 15% of total construction, alteration, or repair work hours must be performed by a qualified apprentice, and that for every 4 employers employed, 1 apprentice shall be employed as well. HB 2356 and SB 853 made it through the General Assembly on strict party line votes. And this week, both bills were vetoed by Governor Youngkin. Next slide, please. As likely everyone watching this knows, interconnection is far from cheap. In recent years here in the PJM footprint, we've seen prices absolutely soar and continue to rise. This is proving cost prohibitive, not just to developers, but to local governments looking to develop solar energy and embrace energy across Virginia. Delegate Charnel Herring brought legislation this year seeking to address that. HB 2113 established the Solar Interconnection Grant Program, which would award public bodies with grants to help offset the costs associated with interconnection. As proposed, this program would be administered by the Department of Energy and would be set up as something of a pilot program with a sunset date of July 1, 2026, and a requirement that the Department of Energy report back to the General Assembly on the efficacy of the program. $1 million was also included in the budget this year to fund the program. HB 2113 passed with wide bipartisan margins in each chamber. Despite this broad support, however, and despite the relatively low cost to the Commonwealth, earlier this week, Governor Youngkin vetoed this bill as well and stripped the $1 million in funding from the budget. Next slide, please. HB 2413 and SB 1021 proposed significant reforms to the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, planning process. This legislation had a number of key elements. It would extend the IRP planning timeline from 15 years to 20 years. It would require Appalachian Power to file an IRP, just as Dominion has long been required to. It changes the frequency of filings from biennial to triennial. Utilities would be required to consider grid-enhancing technologies as alternatives to new transmission infrastructure, and there would be a required stakeholder review process facilitated by a third-party facilitator. While both pieces of legislation here passed both the House and Senate, these also fell victim to the governor's veto this week. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, for the last several years, we've heard lots of concerns and fielded lots of questions from legislators, particularly those in rural districts, asking why can't we locate more solar on rooftops? Responding to those concerns, Delegate Carlson and Senator Van Valkenburg introduced HB 1883 and SB 1040, this session's big DG expansion bills. This legislation would have amended the Clean Economy Act to significantly increase the annual percentage of program requirements to be met with behind-the-meter resources, stepping it up to 3% beginning in 2026 and 5% beginning in 2028. For 2029 to 2031 and every 3-year period thereafter, the SEC would also be required to initiate a proceeding to further modify this percentage. These bills also increase the eligible size of behind-the-meter resources from 1 megawatt to 3 megawatt. And I should note, behind-the-meter resources here is defined as solar, wind, or anaerobic digestion. This legislation also removed the requirements for solar or wind generation facilities to have a capacity of no less than 50 kilowatts to qualify for a third-party power purchase agreement under an existing pilot program. Finally, the legislation delayed the requirements that at least 75% of RECs come from in-state resources until 2027. Throughout session, these bills received strong bipartisan support and passed both chambers. Despite this bipartisan support, Governor Youngkin this week amended the bills to effectively gut them, removing literally all language expanding behind the meter targets and instead leaving only the language pausing in-state retirement requirements. These bills will be taken back up by the General Assembly on Wednesday, April 2nd, where we expect the patrons to move to reject the amendments. Next slide, please. As we just alluded to in the last slide, the Virginia Clean Economy Act currently requires that Dominion meet 1% of its RPS requirements with solar, wind, or anaerobic digestion resources of 1 megawatt or less. Of this 1%, at least 25% must be comprised of low-income projects. HB 1934 and SB 1192 proposed that, to the extent low-income projects are not available, the remainder of this 25% shall be composed of projects located on or adjacent to public elementary or secondary schools. These bills, which were very narrowly drawn, passed the Senate unanimously and the House by fairly wide bipartisan votes. Regardless, Governor Youngkin offered significant amendments to these bills this week. His language not only removes the new solar on schools piece, but it also removes RPS requirements and REC retirements from the VCEA, effectively gutting it. As with the last legislation we mentioned, we expect that when the General Assembly reconvenes next week, the patrons of these bills will move to reject these amendments and send the legislation back to the governor in its originally passed form. Next slide, please. Virtual power plants. HB 2346 and SB 1100 required Dominion to petition the SEC to conduct a virtual power plant pilot program. This program would evaluate grid capacity needs and the ability of virtual power plants to provide grid services during times of peak demand. The pilot would be required to conduct and conclude its initial phase by July 1, 2028, at which time the SEC would be required to review all data and results and evaluate the program's effectiveness, reporting back to the General Assembly. HB 2346 and SB 1100 each passed the House and Senate and were sent to the governor, who this week sent down substantial amendments to this bill as well. Governor Youngkin has proposed converting this pilot program to a study to be conducted by the SEC. As with all other amendments, the General Assembly will decide whether to accept or reject them next week. Next slide, please. HB 2426, Permit by Rule Reform. Currently in Virginia, the Permit by Rule process, or PBR process, is a streamlined permitting process for small renewable energy projects, which are currently defined as hydro project up to 100 megawatts, a biomass project up to 20 megawatts, energy storage project up to 150 megawatts, and solar or wind projects up to 150 megawatts. Delegate Carlson introduced HB 2426 to clarify that a small renewable energy project under the PBR also includes the project's interconnection facilities, meaning their gen tie lines, collector lines, substations, switching stations, and more. This bill would streamline the process and clarify that developers don't have to go through the DEQ's PBR process for generation infrastructure and then go to the SEC for interconnection infrastructure. HB 2426 also called for the DEQ and SEC to enter into a memorandum of understanding to implement this legislation, and it contained a delayed enactment date of July 1, 2026. In its final form, HB 2426 passed the House 90-6 and the Senate 23-15-1. This week, Governor Youngkin sent down substantial amendments. While the governor didn't try to reverse the intent of this bill, as he did with several others, he did amend it so that the PBR process would now include 500 megawatt nuclear projects and 400 megawatt fusion projects. Nuclear and fusion have been a major priority for this administration, which is clearly signaled by this amendment. Next slide, please. The last major legislation we'll address this morning is HB 2537 and SB 1394, which propose significant increases to the Virginia Clean Economy Act's storage goals. For APCO, this legislation proposed 780 megawatts of short duration storage by December 31st, 2040, and 520 megawatts of long duration storage by December 31st, 2045. For Dominion, this legislation proposed 4,000 megawatts of short duration storage by December 31st, 2040, and 3,480 megawatts of long duration storage by December 31st, 2045. Critically, this legislation also gave the SEC discretion to adjust these targets as needed, so they were empowered to raise them, lower them, or keep them as they are. Finally, this legislation proposed two work groups, one to research and determine recommendations for financial incentives for long-duration storage, and one to develop model local ordinances for energy storage. This legislation had quite the journey through the General Assembly and ultimately passed both chambers by bipartisan votes after multiple rounds of revisions. This week, however, the governor effectively gutted the bill, amending the legislation to not just not propose new storage development goals, but to repeal the RPS requirements of the Clean Economy Act entirely. We expect that on Wednesday, when the General Assembly reconvenes, they will reject these amendments. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I know with all of these vetoes and amendments, you may be thinking, what comes next? Where do we go from here? What's going on in Virginia? Well, things don't end with this session. And frankly, often the biggest legislative wins take more than 1 year to accomplish. Having been a part of a lot of the bills that were just discussed, I can safely tell you that many, if not most of these ideas and bills will be coming back next year. And once again, it's election season in Virginia. This year, the entire House of Delegates is back up for election, and our three statewide officers, governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, are up for election. In Virginia, governors are forbidden from running for consecutive terms, so one way or another, we will have a new governor elected come November. So stay tuned. This is going to be quite the election season here in Virginia, and we'll lay a lot of groundwork for what will prove to be a very robust 2026 legislative session. Next slide, please. Brad, back to you.
Great, thanks, Chris, for that. And I'll mention we have on our website, we have a listing of all of these bills as well as links to Virginia LIS. So you can read the actual bills of language themselves, and you can follow on kind of what the governor's next actions are. We've got a couple minutes remaining, and we've got a couple of questions here. First question, Chris, is there any off-season work expected on citing reform or other bills?
You know, at this point, it's speculation since they still have to get the reconvene session next year, but I would say there will certainly be work on that. This was really a priority of the legislature, priority of the industry, priority of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. In Virginia, we are seeing the demand for electricity continue to rise, both due to population growth, EV infrastructure being deployed, data center growth, and we're not seeing generation come online as quickly as it needs to. So I think without a doubt, there will be multiple stakeholder groups convened. I'm sure CURE will take another look at this in the off season. And I think it's a near certainty that 2026 will see citing reform legislation brought back.
Another question was about fusion energy. You mentioned about a fusion energy bill. Was this the only legislation that ended up touching fusion or nuclear?
No, it's a good question. As mentioned, Governor Youngkin's administration has really put a priority on fusion and nuclear, trying to find a way to develop and deploy SMRs and new fusion technology. So while they inserted language about that in the PBR legislation we discussed, there were other pieces of legislation that were more direct. This session, there were two bills introduced, HB 2197 and SB 1091, that would have added nuclear facilities to the list of resources that would be considered eligible for Virginia's RPS. Both of these bills did fail in committee after robust debate. There were also two bills introduced, HB 1779 and SB 1338, that added fusion energy to the list of generation resources that actually qualify as carbon-free or clean energy under the Virginia Code. So they joined solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal generation. These bills actually unanimously passed both the House and Senate and have already been signed into law by Governor Youngkin.
Why don't we do one last question? This is about the Appalachian Power rates. I saw towards the end of the session, a lot of news about potential rate freezes for Appalachian Power customers. What happened with that proposal?
Yeah, this legislation generated a lot of interest and a lot of press, particularly at the end of the legislative session. This was legislation introduced by Delegate Jason Ballard and Senator Mark Peake, and it really did two things. First, the legislation authorized Appalachian Power to securitize certain asset costs, ostensibly those associated with their power plants, as well as certain repairs needed to deal with the damage that was left across Southwest Virginia by Hurricane Helene. By doing this would allow APCO to effectively spread out significant costs over a longer period of time and help them mitigate a more immediate or drastic impact on their ratepayers as they have to pay for these repairs. Secondly, and to your question, this legislation prohibits rate increases for Appalachian Power during the months of November through February, and it prohibits rate adjustment clauses from taking effect on customer bills between the months of November through February. This would also prohibit Appalachian Power from charging a residential customer interest or late fees between July 1, 2025 and December 31st, 2025, and from charging a residential customer any reconnection fees between July 1, 2025 and March 1, 2026. This legislation went through numerous revisions up until the very last minute. Both bills were passed by each chamber, and on Monday of this week, Governor Youngkin did sign this legislation into law.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. If you asked a question and we didn't have a chance to answer it, we'll respond separately. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to email us or send an email to energy@williamsmullen.com. I appreciate everybody attending today, and thanks, Chris, for the presentation. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everybody.